The dust of Redemption Creek was a fine, gritty powder that coated everything. The warped planks of the general store porch, the trough where weary horses drank, and the dark serge of the woman's dress. For 3 days, she had been a fixture on the bench outside the land office, as constant and silent as the heat shimmer rising from the beaten earth. She is unclaimed. A parcel misdelivered, a promise unkept. The town watches her. Women peer from behind parted curtains, whispering. Men tip their hats with a touch too much pity or a glance that lingers with a different, more predatory kind of interest. She keeps her eyes fixed on the worn toes of her boots, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles are bone white. She has become a public spectacle of rejection, and her stillness is the only defense she has left. On the 3rd day, a wagon rattles into the outpost, pulled by a single, sturdy mule. A man sits at the reins, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seems older than his years. His face is sunbrowned and stubbled, carved with lines of work and worry. Beside him, a small girl, no older than 6, bounces with an energy that defies the oppressive heat. Her blonde hair is a wild halo under a faded sunbonnet. This is Silas Cole and his daughter, Lily. They are here for flour, salt, and news from the world beyond their isolated homestead. As Silas ties the mule to the hitching post, Lily's bright, curious eyes scan the small collection of buildings and people. They land on the still figure on the bench. The girl stops, her head cocked. She sees not a disgrace, not a problem, but simply a woman, alone. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. Silas is already heading for the store, his mind on the dwindling supplies and the fence line that needs mending before the season turns. He doesn't notice his daughter has frozen. He doesn't hear the silence that suddenly falls over the dusty street. He only turns when he feels a tug on his trousers. Lily is pointing, her small finger outstretched and unwavering, aimed directly at the woman on the bench. The child's voice, high and clear as a bell, cuts through the afternoon stillness, carrying to every listening ear. "Pa," she says, her tone one of simple, profound discovery. "That's her. Be my ma." The world stopped. For Silas Cole, the dust ceased its lazy swirl, the buzz of flies went silent, and the sun seemed to pause its trek across the vast, indifferent sky. Every eye in Redemption Creek. The storekeeper, Mr. Gable, wiping the counter just inside the door. 2 cowhands loitering near the saloon. Mrs. Gable herself, her face a mask of pinched disapproval behind her window, swiveled from the woman on the bench to him. Silas felt a hot flush creep up his neck, a mortification so profound it was almost painful. He looked down at his daughter, whose face was alight with pure, undiluted hope, then at the woman, whose head had finally snapped up. Her name was Elspeth Dunn, and in that moment, she looked like a startled doe, her gray eyes wide with shock and a fresh wave of humiliation. For 3 days, she had endured the speculative stares and whispered judgments. She had come all the way from a crowded, sooty town in Ohio, her passage paid for by a man who had described himself in letters as kindly and established. He had promised a new life under a bigger sky. When her stage had arrived, a portly man named Finch with slick hair and shifty eyes had taken one look at her, his gaze catching on the faint, silvery scar that traced a line from her temple into her hairline, a childhood memento from a falling piece of firewood. His lip had curled. "You ain't what was advertised," he'd said, loud enough for the stage driver and 2 other passengers to hear. And he had turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the dust. The outpost master had given her 3 days. After that, he'd said with a sigh, she was on her own. Her money was nearly gone, spent on the long, rattling journey west. She had nowhere to go back to, and nowhere to go forward. Now, this child's impossible question had thrown a lit match into the powder keg of her quiet despair. Silas felt a surge of anger, at the situation, at the staring town, at the universe for putting him in this position. His life was a fragile structure of work, grief, and duty, held together by sheer will. 2 years ago, he had buried his wife, Sarah, along with the infant son she had died birthing. The loss had hollowed him out, leaving him with a sprawling, silent homestead and a daughter who was growing up in the shadow of his sorrow. He was a rancher, a father, and a widower. He was not in the market for a wife. He opened his mouth to shush Lily, to apologize to the woman, to retreat back into the anonymity of his hard life. But he couldn't. He saw the tremor in the woman's hands, the desperate fight for composure in her eyes. He saw the leering smirk on one of the cowhands by the saloon, a man known for trouble. And worst of all, he saw the fierce, pleading hope in Lily's face. To deny her so publicly, to walk away, would be to crush a part of his daughter he had fought so hard to protect. It would also be to abandon this woman to a fate he didn't want to contemplate. Mr. Gable stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his apron. "Well, Silas," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "The girl's made her choice. What are you going to do? Can't leave the poor woman sit in here forever." The words, meant to be helpful, felt like a cage closing around him. Silas's mind raced. He was a practical man, a man who solved problems with his hands. This was a problem of the heart, of society, of propriety. He was out of his depth. He looked at Elspeth again. She wasn't a girl. She was a woman grown, with hardship etched in the fine lines around her eyes, but also a strength in the set of her jaw. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he saw not a victim, but an equal in desperation. He took a deep breath, the dusty air searing his lungs. The decision he made was not born of romance or charity, but of grim necessity. It was a shield for them all. He strode over to the bench, his heavy boots sounding unnaturally loud. He stopped before her, casting a long shadow over her seated form. He ignored the gaping onlookers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was rough from disuse. "My girl, she speaks out of turn." He paused, searching for the right words, but there were none. "I have a homestead, north of here. It's a lot of work, and the girl needs looking after." He couldn't bring himself to say the word mother. "I can't offer you what that man promised, but I can offer you a roof and meals. You can earn your keep until you figure out what's next for you." It was a cold, transactional offer. A job. He was offering her the position of a hired hand, a housekeeper, a nanny. He was offering her a way to disappear from the public eye and salvage a sliver of her dignity and his. Elspeth looked from his hard, unreadable face to the little girl who was now hiding shyly behind his leg, peeking out at her. Hope and fear warred in her chest. To accept was to trade one form of uncertainty for another, to place her trust in a stranger whose kindness was buried under layers of gruff practicality. But to refuse? To refuse was to face the coming night on this bench, with dwindling options and growing threats. She had survived so far on a bedrock of pride. Now, she realized survival sometimes meant swallowing that pride whole. She rose slowly from the bench, her limbs stiff. She was taller than he'd expected, and thinner. She smoothed down her dress, a small, unconscious gesture of composure. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I accept your offer." The ride to the homestead was a study in silence. Silas drove the wagon, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could will the miles to pass faster. Elspeth sat on the buckboard beside him, her back ramrod straight, her small carpetbag clutched in her lap. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the mule, and the ceaseless, happy chatter of Lily, who sat squeezed between them, a living, breathing bridge over a chasm of awkwardness. "We have chickens," Lily announced to Elspeth. 7 of them. One is named Mrs. Feathers, and she's mean. And Pa is building a new stall for Blue. That's the mule. Are you good at building things? Ma was good at singing. The name hit the air and hung there. Silas flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his hands on the reins. Elspeth fell silent, the blood draining from her face. "Lily," Silas said, his voice tight. "Her name is Miss Dunn. But she's my new ma," Lily insisted, her lower lip trembling. "She is a guest," Silas corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She is here to help. You will be respectful." Lily's face crumpled, and she buried her head in Elspeth's side. Instinctively, Elspeth put an arm around the small, shaking shoulders, pulling the child close. She shot a look at Silas, a flicker of defiance in her gray eyes. It was a look that said, "She is only a child." He saw it, and for a moment, his hard expression wavered, replaced by a flash of guilt. He said nothing more for the rest of the journey. The homestead was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of gnarled cottonwoods. It was a place of stark, lonely beauty. The cabin was sturdy, built of hand-hewn logs, but the porch sagged slightly, and the yard was overgrown in patches. A barn stood nearby, its wood weathered to a silver gray. It was a man's world, functional and devoid of any softening touch. As Elspeth stepped down from the wagon, the silence of the place washed over her. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the wind whispering through the tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk. This was isolation on a scale she had never imagined. It was both terrifying and, in a strange way, a relief. Here, there were no prying eyes. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A pot of what looked like day-old stew sat cold on the hearth. It was clear that this was a house, not a home. The ghost of the woman Lily called Ma was everywhere and nowhere at once. Her absence was a palpable presence, a hole in the fabric of the little family that Elspeth had just stumbled into. That first night, Elspeth cooked. While Silas was in the barn, she found the meager stores, flour, beans, a few potatoes, some salted pork, and set to work. She scrubbed the stew pot clean, kneaded dough for biscuits, and made a simple, hearty meal. She moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her exhaustion. When Silas came in, smelling of hay and sweat, he stopped in the doorway. The cabin was warmer. A lamp was lit, casting a golden glow. The table was set for 3, and the air was filled with the unfamiliar, comforting scent of baking bread. He didn't say anything, but as he sat down and ate, she saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. He ate 2 helpings of the stew and 3 biscuits. Lily, her earlier sadness forgotten, chattered happily, her mouth full. For the first time in a long time, a meal in this cabin felt like something other than a chore. Elspeth was given a small room at the back, barely more than a closet, which had clearly been used for storage. It had a narrow cot and a single small window that looked out onto the vast, star-dusted prairie. As she lay down that night, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, she felt a bone-deep weariness. She was a stranger in a strange man's house, her future as uncertain as the dark land stretching out beyond the window. But she had a roof over her head. She had work to do, and a little girl who had, for some unknowable reason, chosen her. It wasn't a promise of happiness, but it was a chance, and a chance was more than she'd had that morning. The days fell into a rhythm. Elspeth rose before dawn, lighting the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She learned the landscape of Silas's grief through the objects in his house. In a drawer, she found a half-finished piece of embroidery, a pattern of bluebells, the needle still threaded. She touched it gently and closed the drawer. She found a small, worn book of poetry tucked under a loose floorboard near the hearth, a single pressed prairie rose marking a page. These were the faint traces of Sarah Cole, and Elspeth treated them like sacred relics, carefully cleaning around them, never disturbing them. She was not here to replace anyone. She was here to survive. Her survival took the form of work. She cleaned the cabin until it shone, mended the tears in Silas's shirts and Lily's dresses, and waged a war against the encroaching wilderness in the small vegetable garden. She discovered she had a knack for it. The soil responded to her patient hands, and soon, green shoots began to poke through the dark earth. Silas watched her from a distance. He'd come in from the fields to find his lunch pail packed with something other than dry jerky and a cold biscuit. He'd see her talking to the chickens as she scattered their feed, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. He began to see the woman, not the predicament. He saw the resilience in her straight back, the intelligence in her quick eyes. Lily was her shadow. The little girl followed her everywhere, her endless questions a constant stream. Can you braid hair like an angel? Do you know songs about the moon? Elspeth, who had grown up in a crowded orphanage with little time for whimsy, found herself inventing stories and humming forgotten lullabies. She braided Lily's wild hair every morning, her fingers gentle. The child thrived under the attention, her laughter echoing in the once silent cabin. One afternoon, Lily started calling her Ma again, this time in a quiet, tentative voice. They were in the garden, pulling weeds. Ma, she whispered. Can you help me with this big one? That evening, Silas heard it. The word was a blade twisting in the old wound of his grief. After he put Lily to bed, he found Elspeth on the porch, staring out at the twilight. I told you not to let her do that, he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Elspeth didn't turn. I did not let her, Mr. Cole. It came from her heart. To forbid it is to hurt her. It's not right, he ground out, leaning against a porch post. You are not her mother. Sarah was her mother. Finally, she turned to face him, her silhouette framed by the dying light. I know that, she said, her voice soft but firm. I see your wife everywhere in this house. In the way you still look toward the door when you come inside. In the things you cannot bring yourself to put away. I am not trying to be her. I could never be. But Lily is alive, and she is lonely. She needs kindness. She needs a woman's care. Call me Miss Dunn. Call me Elspeth. Call me a hired hand. But when I am with her, I will not refuse her comfort. I will not be cruel just to protect a memory. Her words struck him silent. She had seen his grief, not as a wall to keep her out, but as a room he was trapped in. She wasn't asking him to leave it, only to let some light in for his daughter. He looked at her, at the quiet dignity that seemed to be her armor, and felt a grudging respect. He gave a curt nod. See that you don't, he muttered, but the anger had gone out of him, replaced by a weary confusion. A month after her arrival, they needed supplies. The trip back to Redemption Creek filled Elspeth with a quiet dread. She felt the eyes on them the moment their wagon rolled into town. Whispers followed them like burrs on a saddle blanket. As Silas loaded sacks of flour into the wagon, Elspeth took Lily into the general store to buy thread. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, her face a sour knot. Well, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Playing house, are we, Silas? She called out the door to him. Settling in nicely, is she? I hope this one proves more durable. The cruelty of the remark, a clear, vicious jab at Sarah's death in childbirth, sucked the air from the room. Elspeth froze, her hand hovering over a spool of black thread. Lily, sensing the tension, pressed against her leg. Before Elspeth could even process the sting, Silas was there. He filled the doorway, his size and the sudden thunder on his face making the store feel small. He didn't say a word. He simply fixed Mrs. Gable with a look of such cold, quiet fury that the woman paled and took a step back, suddenly busying herself under the counter. Silas put his hand on Elspeth's elbow. We have what we need, he said, his voice low. He guided her and Lily out of the store, loaded them into the wagon, and drove them away from the outpost without a backward glance. On the ride home, Elspeth kept replaying the moment in her mind. He had defended her, not just her, but the sanctity of their arrangement and the memory of his wife. He had shielded her from the town's venom. It was the first time he had acted not as her reluctant benefactor, but as her protector. She stole a glance at his stern profile, at the hard line of his jaw, and felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It felt dangerously like gratitude, but it was tangled with something more complicated, something she didn't dare name. The turning point came with the sky. The clouds gathered one afternoon, dark and bruised, and the wind picked up, howling like a hungry wolf. A late-season storm, vicious and sudden, slammed into the homestead. Rain came down in sheets, and a powerful gust of wind tore a section of the barn roof clean off, sending shingles flying like deadly projectiles. The hay, Silas yelled over the roar of the storm. If it gets soaked, we'll lose half of it. There was no time for thought, only action. He ran for the barn, and without a second's hesitation, Elspeth followed, tying a scarf over her hair. Lily, pale with fear, was told to stay in the cabin, away from the windows. For the next hour, they fought the storm together. Drenched to the bone and shivering, they hauled tarps over the exposed hay bales, their hands slipping on the wet canvas. The wind tried to rip the heavy cloth from their grasp, but they held on, a grim, desperate team. Silas shouted instructions, and Elspeth obeyed, her movements quick and sure. At one point, a heavy beam, loosened by the wind, began to slide from the rafters directly above her. Elspeth moved. Silas roared. He lunged, shoving her sideways onto a pile of hay, just as the beam crashed down where she had been standing, splintering on the packed earth. They stared at each other for a heart-stopping second, the rain plastering their hair to their faces, their chests heaving. The danger, the shared adrenaline, had stripped away all pretense. In that moment, they were not a widower and a hired hand. They were two people fighting for a shared future, for the survival of this small piece of land that was, for better or worse, their world. When the worst of the storm had passed, leaving a trail of debris and a leaking roof, they stumbled back into the cabin, exhausted and soaked. Lily rushed to them, crying with relief. Elspeth knelt and held her tight, murmuring reassurances. Silas built up the fire until it blazed, and they huddled before it, wrapped in dry blankets, steam rising from their clothes. The silence between them was different now. It was not awkward or strained, but filled with the unspoken things, the gratitude for a life saved, the respect for a partner found in the heat of battle. Silas looked at Elspeth, her face smudged with dirt, her gray eyes luminous in the firelight as she held his sleeping daughter. The thought of the cabin without her, the thought of that beam falling a second sooner, sent a cold dread through him that had nothing to do with the storm. He was beginning to realize that the roof she had helped him save was not just the one on his barn, but the one over his heart. A week later, the devil came back to Redemption Creek. Elspeth was outside, hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts, when she saw the fancy buggy approaching. A man in a tailored city suit held the reins. As he drew closer, the blood froze in her veins. It was him, Mr. Finch, the man who had bought her sight unseen and discarded her like a faulty piece of equipment. He pulled his horse to a stop, his gaze sweeping over the tidy yard, the thriving garden, and finally landing on her. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. He took in her appearance. Her hair was neat, she had color in her cheeks, and her dress, though simple, was clean and mended. She was no longer the wilted, desperate creature he had abandoned on the Outpost bench. "Well, now," Finch said, his voice oily. "Look what the cat dragged in. I heard rumors Silas Cole had picked up some stray, but I never imagined it was my own lost property." Elspeth's hands tightened on the damp sheet she was holding. "I am not your property," she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "Aren't you?" he sneered, stepping down from the buggy. "I have a contract. Paid your passage. You belong to me. It seems I was hasty in my judgment. A little country air has done you good. You've proven you're not as delicate as you looked." He was looking at her not as a person, but as an investment he had foolishly written off, one that was now showing unexpected returns. Just then, Silas came around the side of the barn, a hammer in his hand. He stopped dead when he saw Finch. His face darkened. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Finch laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think I am. I've come to collect what's mine. This woman is my betrothed, by contract. I've already spoken to Marshal Thompson at the Outpost. He agrees. You've been harboring my intended. The law is on my side, Cole. You have 24 hours to return her to me in town, or I'll have you charged with theft." He tipped his hat to Elspeth with mocking gallantry, climbed back into his buggy, and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. That night, the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. Lily, sensing the oppressive tension, was subdued, clinging to Elspeth's skirt. After the child was asleep, Silas and Elspeth sat at the table, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The pretense was gone. She was no longer just a housekeeper, and he was no longer just her employer. They were two people trapped by a piece of paper signed 1,000 miles away. "What are you going to do?" Elspeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him. She stared at her hands, which lay folded on the table. They were no longer the pale, soft hands of a woman who did needlepoint. They were chapped and calloused from the garden, from the lye soap, from the work of this life. Silas didn't answer for a long time. He stared into the flickering lamp flame, his mind a battlefield. He could give her up. It would be the simplest thing. It would restore the silence to his house, the solitude to his life. He could go back to the way things were, just him and Lily and the ghost of his wife. But the thought of it was no longer a comfort. It was a bleak, desolate emptiness. He thought of the cabin without the smell of baking bread. He thought of Lily's laughter fading again into whispers. He thought of Elspeth, her quiet strength, her fierce defense of his daughter, her courage in the face of the storm. He thought of her being handed over to a man like Finch, a man who saw her as a piece of livestock. The choice was no choice at all. He had been drifting in the sea of his grief for 2 years. This woman, and his daughter's love for her, had been an unexpected anchor. To let her go now would be to cut the rope and drift away for good. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his own. His hand was large and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. She finally looked up, her eyes wide and searching in the dim light. "He's not taking you," Silas said, his voice low and resolute. "He's not taking you from Lily. And he's not taking you from me." He stood up. "Get your shawl. We're going to town." The porch of the Redemption Creek General Store was a stage, and Finch had assembled his audience. He stood there with Marshall Thompson, a portly, indecisive man who clearly wished he were anywhere else. A handful of curious townspeople, including the ever-watchful Mrs. Gable, formed a semicircle. When Silas's wagon appeared, a murmur went through the small crowd. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and helped Elspeth down. Lily, sensing the gravity of the moment, held on to Elspeth's hand with a desperate grip. They walked together to face Finch, a united front of 3. "Ah, Cole, good of you to see reason," Finch said with a triumphant smirk. "Just hand her over, and we'll forget this whole unfortunate business. Come along, woman. Your contract is with me." Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Finch and Elspeth. He was no longer the grieving, withdrawn farmer. He was a man defending his territory, his family. "There is no business," Silas stated, his voice ringing with a clarity that commanded attention. "You had a contract, Finch, that's true. But you broke it. You broke it here, in front of this whole town, when you declared her worthless and cast her aside. A contract requires honor. You have none." A few people in the crowd shifted, murmuring their agreement. They all remembered Finch's public cruelty. Finch's face flushed with anger. "The law is the law. She is mine." It was then that Elspeth found her voice. She had spent a lifetime being silent, being overlooked, being judged. But the woman who had fought a storm and faced down a widower's grief was not the same one who had sat on that bench. She stepped out from behind Silas, her head held high. Her gaze was not on Finch, but on the marshal and the people of the town. "Mr. Finch is right," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the dusty street. "I came here under contract to be his wife. But he broke that contract when he publicly shamed me and left me destitute. A person is not a parcel to be claimed and unclaimed at will. A bond between a man and a woman must be built on respect. Mr. Finch showed me none." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces watching her. "But I have found respect here." She turned and looked at Silas. "My place is here." The crowd was silent, captivated. Finch stood sputtering, his legal argument crumbling under the weight of simple human decency. Then Silas did something that stunned them all. He took Elspeth's hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of everyone. He turned to Marshall Thompson, his expression unwavering. "She is not his property. And she is not my housekeeper." He took a deep breath, the final wall around his heart crumbling to dust. "She is my wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas ignored them, his eyes finding the town's circuit preacher, Reverend Michael, who had been watching the proceedings from the edge of the crowd. "Reverend," Silas called out, "I'm asking you to marry us. Right here. Right now." Finch's face was a mask of pure, humiliated rage. The marshal, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so decisively, simply shrugged and shook his head at Finch. "Sounds to me like the lady's made her choice, Mr. Finch. And Mr. Cole has made his intentions clear. I suggest you move on." Defeated and disgraced, Finch stormed back to his buggy and rode away, leaving not victory but the sour taste of his own hypocrisy in the air. In the golden light of the setting sun, with the people of Redemption Creek as their witnesses, Silas Cole and Elspeth Dunn were married. The words were simple, the ceremony brief, but the vows they exchanged on that dusty porch were as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. The ride home was different. The silence was still there, but it was a shared, comfortable quiet, filled with the enormity of what had just happened. Lily, exhausted by the day's emotion, had fallen asleep, her head resting in Elspeth's lap. When they reached the homestead, the familiar cabin looked different, imbued with a new light. It was truly their home now. Inside, As Elspeth put a sleeping Lily to bed, Silas did something he hadn't been able to do for 2 years. He climbed the ladder to the small loft, found the small wooden chest containing Sarah's embroidery and her book of poems, and gently placed it in the far corner, covering it with a clean cloth. He was not erasing the past, but he was finally, respectfully, making room for the future. When he came back down, Elspeth was standing by the hearth, her shawl still wrapped around her shoulders. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "The declaration. The wedding." "Yes, I did," he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he was no longer trying to hide. He crossed the room and stood before her. He reached out and gently, tentatively, touched the silvery scar at her temple, the flaw that Finch had recoiled from, the mark she had always tried to hide. "This is just a part of you," he said, his thumb stroking her skin. "It's not all of you." It was the most intimate thing he had ever said to her. It was an acceptance of all her history, all her hurts, all her strength. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. He had seen her, truly seen her, not as a solution to a problem or a replacement for what he'd lost, but as herself. He took her hand, the one that was calloused and strong from her work on their farm. It fit perfectly inside his own. Outside, the wind swept across the vast, dark plains, a lonely and endless sound. But inside the small cabin, warmed by the fire and a shared, unspoken promise, 3 souls were no longer unclaimed. They were a family, forged not by contract, but by courage, kindness, and a little girl's impossible wish. He looked at the woman who was now his wife, and for the first time in a long time, Silas Cole felt like he was home.